Hi, I'm Rejoy.
And I'm Colin.
Ah,
We're
that was
slick.
there for dramatic pause, I see. Very well done. And welcome back to the Rum Ration, where today we're continuing with part two about the RMR's extraordinary journey from Montreal to the front lines in France. And in the first episode, Colin and I talked a bit about their training, how they got to England, prepared for the introduction to the war. And now in the second phase, it gets really quite exciting because they embark for the front lines and their first introduction and experience of trench life.
Right. The first introduction as to what was going to be the reality for the next several years, right? So that's right. First baptism of fire really for the RMR and all the Canadians, except for the PPCLI, who had been, they were outside of the Canadian expedition and been there a couple of months prior. It really came in February and March 1915. And today we'll be piercing together what life was like for them once they arrived at the front. Rejoy and I have always tried to talk about how life is more than just combat. We've talked before about training accidents and just things that happen in reality, but we'll be drawing from some firsthand letters, regimental histories. You got your new copy of Volume 1 there, Rejoy, and contemporary newspaper reports. There was a lot of newspaper coverage at the time. And the RMR was very fortunate that it actually had members who worked for the Montreal Gazette and got us some really good coverage. So we're going to try and paint as vivid a picture as possible of what life in the trenches was. And it wasn't just about combat, like I said. It was about enduring the elements, the rain, the cold, adapting to the horrors of war from the death that was around them, from the rats, from everything. And, of course, trying to find some moments of camaraderie amid the chaos. Danger and death were a constant companion. We'll hear about the shelling, snipers, and the terrible living conditions. And this was, as I said, the new reality for the next 3.5 years.
Indeed. You mentioned the PPCLI. I think, if I'm not mistaken, they actually deployed in October 1914, the first boots on the ground for the Canadians. But if somebody out there could confirm that, I'm not sure, but I do remember, I might be mistaken, but I read that somewhere years ago. But if somebody could confirm that, that'd be great.
Well, they were definitely the
And
first Canadian unit in combat
there
in World
were.
War One. There's no question. A
Before
good
we
Montreal
jump in,
connection, right?
that's right, indeed. Again, well, you'll find there are a lot of Montreal connections throughout the war. And before we jump in, a quick thanks again to former RMR captain Hamilton Slessor and his wife Jane for their work on this day in RMR history, which has been a treasure trove of information and facts for that we've drawn upon, and has provided great material. If you get a chance, please go visit that on the RMR website. You'll find lots of good information and stories right there. So let's get started with part two of this episode.
Right. And just to recap our first episode in this two-part series that we're doing, in late January 1915, the RMR, as part of the entire 17,000 plus man 1st Canadian Division, received orders to move. They were finally deploying to the front lines of the Western Front. And after a stormy crossing of the English Channel on transport ships, a crossing that was actually so rough that a soldier on the same ship that the RMR was being carried on was killed in an
Wasn't a
accident
pleasure cruise, was it?
yeah, no pleasure groove at all. And a rogue wave smashed him into a metal bulkhead. And he was buried at sea. And arriving in France, the RMR was actually welcomed quite warmly by the local French population, especially since about a third of the RMR spoke French. And but any charm of their initial arrival and warm welcome from the paysans was quickly overshadowed by the realities of war.
It begins with how they were transported to the front, again squeezed into those which are now really infamous French boxcars, the huit chevaux, camaraderie, which I think will go down in history and will carry on for years and years. And then, of course, marching them in the blistering cobblestone roads. So, for all you guys out there who remember complaining about your first forced marches, breaking in the boots, what we talked about earlier on, imagine doing that on cobblestone roads. Walking those roads, even with regular shoes, are painful. And of course, it took a painful toll on on the feet of many soldiers. Indeed, after days of marching, they approached the front lines, and one of the first things they would have encountered is the distant sound of the artillery and gunfire, that rolling thunder that seemed to be a constant factor of life on the Western Front. Um, In fact, as one RMR diarist recalled, no complaints were recorded, however, as during the march, a low muttering, rumbling sound drifted back from some point far ahead. Unmistakably, it was the thunder of distant guns. Hearts leaped, and a shiver of excitement ran through the ranks.
Yeah, that excitement would soon be tempered by the brutality of trench life. The
Indeed.
RMR's first casualty, Private Eaton, was recorded shortly after they arrived, which was a stark reminder that they were stepping into a deadly environment. It's worth noting for any of our non-military listeners what the definition of a casualty is. Sometimes there's confusion, and I can understand how you could be listening to reports on the conflict in Ukraine right now and think there could be 600,000 killed versus 200,000 killed or 100,000 killed. A casualty, for military terms, is either killed, wounded, or taken prisoner, usually resulting in action. So the RMR and the other Canadian units had lost people up until 1915, up until going into the trenches, but they weren't necessarily considered casualties, even though they are recorded in the official war dead. They would have been training accidents in the UK. They could have died of meningitis, other sicknesses. Sickness was still a big cause of casualties. But just to clarify that when we say casualty, we don't necessarily mean killed, although in World War One and oftentimes now about a third, you can always do about a third of any casualty figure would be considered killed.
Yeah, thanks for that. That's very true. Um, so now we get into the trenches. And by that point, trench warfare had been established. So what the British Army used to do to acclimatize new troops into trench life was to bring them in small batches for short periods of time. And that's exactly what happened to the first elements of the RMR. On February 24th, 1915, exactly 6 months after the battalion had left Montreal, the platoons were sent in small groups to the front line for their first exposure to trench warfare. And like we talked about earlier on in a previous episode, there was actually a competition among the men to be part of the first group to go forward. Officers and men alike wanted the honor of being the first RMR troops to face enemy fire. Ah, the folly of youth, Colin,
Seriously.
and not really understanding what it is they were going to be getting themselves into, um, and off they went.
Yeah, they're probably not alone, and probably won't be the first nor the last to ever volunteered for unpleasant duties, getting excited and wanting to prove themselves. And what they faced was a stark new reality. The trenches were cold, wet, filled with mud, constantly collapsing and having to be redug out. They'd been hastily dug originally. They're often knee deep in water, and the troops weren't wearing hip waders or like that. They were just issued their leather ankle boots and woolen and cotton puttees covering them
Again,
all.
these are not the trenches of 1916,
No,
1917
no,
at all, are
no.
they?
And we can get into trenches further on, but the Allies never really developed their trenches quite as well as the Germans. They had the impression that if they made them too luxurious, the troops wouldn't want to get out and they wouldn't attack. But as I said, often knee deep in water. They were lined with sandbags that provided some cover, but little comfort. And to their horror, they of course discovered that not all the sandbags were actually sandbags, which we'll get into a bit. And these were the conditions that the first battle casualty of the RMR occurred. Richard Eaton, as I mentioned, who lived on Seymour Street in Montreal, which I looked up, Rejoy, and it's not far from the old Forum, about a 20-minute walk from where I live, actually. So he would have been
Wow.
15-minute walk from the RMR's armory today, near Tupper Street in Fort. He was shot in the face and evacuated to number 13 military hospital in Boulogne. And it sounds like a terrible wound because these are large caliber weapons at the time. And it must have been a sobering wake-up call for the rest of his comrades. And it was noted that Private Eaton was later deemed medically unfit on November 4th, 1915, as a result of his wounds and would have been discharged.
Those first casualties always come as a tremendous shock as the reality of warfare sets in.
Could make some
Trench
sort of
life,
inappropriate comment about a guy getting wounded in the face, like a slap in the face to his troops, but I wouldn't do that.
no, no, no. That was very well handled. So, and trench life itself wasn't very easy. It like you described it, Colin, very very aptly. It was horrible. And what a wake up call it was. And one soldier described it bluntly in a letter home. He wrote, "Quote: It is not what we expected. The dirt, the rats, the lice. We will endure it, but my God, it is worse than I ever imagined." Kind of makes you wonder what he was expecting, though. The official regimental history described the first trenches that the RMR moved into as, quote, water and bodies buried but a few inches beneath the surface had rendered the construction of underground shelters impossible. Many bodies had been buried in the parapet of the trenches, scores lay unburied between the lines, large rats wandered everywhere, and sanitary arrangements were, from a Canadian point of view, inadequate. Consequently, the line was dangerous and possessed with the most sickening smell imaginable. I don't want to cast aspersion on everyone, but there are a lot of soldiers are going on record of describing the differences between the British constructed trenches and the French constructed trenches. And if the idea was not to make them too comfortable, well, the French idea was not to make them inhabitable at all, it seemed. And so there are a lot of complaints by Commonwealth troops taking over French trenches and having to re-buttress them and clean them out and all sorts of things. So it kind of makes me wonder if they took over part of the line that had been previously held by a French regiment. But nevertheless, bodies being buried in the parapet of trenches as was essentially using the bodies as you had mentioned earlier, Colin, as sandbags. So can you imagine, as a young soldier having no experience of any of all this, getting into that filthy, disgusting, terrifying environment, and then discovering that your sandbag is actually somebody who was killed earlier on?
Yeah,
Terrifying.
and I know the official regimental history. I'm not sure which trenches they're referring to on this one, but some of the earliest trenches they moved into, they had taken them over. They were in pretty good condition because they'd taken them over from the Grenadier Guards, the official British regiment. And it's interesting to see the fanboy writing because aristocrats and the royalty were considered the influencers or the celebrities of the day, right? And there was mention that one of the sections of trench had been like the Prince of Wales had been the company commander, and that's pretty epic, pretty epic to read. But yeah, daily life in the trenches is what we'll get into next, and the daily routine in the trenches really revolves around three main things: staying alive, staying warm, and waiting for food, waiting for orders, waiting for your podcast co-host to show up on time. That's what Rejoy's life's all about. Waiting for the next barrage of artillery or sniper fire. And even the move into the trenches was fraught with anxiety. As Private
Mm.
Whitby, formerly the Montreal Gazette that I'd mentioned earlier, he wrote about entering the trenches for the first time. Quote, "We trudged away at midnight, each man loaded down in heavy marching order, with great coat, fur trench coat." That's the infamous goat skin jackets that we talked about in our last
Oh,
episode.
yes, yes.
Rations, blankets, rubber sheet, personal kit, ammunition, rifle, accoutrements, mess tin, firewood, etc. Ingeniously hung about his person, the collection making each of them look like an animated Christmas tree. Soon we got within sound of the scattered rifle firing, with a new sound, very much like a pneumatic riveter on a skyscraper, which our guides explained were machine guns. Bullets now began to whiz across the road, droning like angry hornets. "Much further through this?" asked someone. "About 20 minutes," answered the guide. And it seemed long enough. It certainly was a busy highway, though by no means a safe one. We later heard that seldom a night passed without one or more wayfarers paying toll with their lives.
Really terrifying when you think about it and hear it in that way. As you said, as you settle into the trenches, you're waiting, doing a lot of waiting for food, and food is a major component of trench life. Um, Not exactly five-star dining. You're in France, but you're not getting Michelin star quality food. Very basic stuff. I mean, it's it's pretty grim when you look at it. Tinned beef, hardtack biscuits, and tea, of course, tea. So the rations were brought up from the rear each day and were cooked or warmed up or not in the trenches. And this actually reminds me of a line in a letter that Major Paul Hansen, again, who is a wealth of information in his correspondence, and a company commander with the RMR during the war. And in a letter home, he wrote how, well, let me just give a background to this. Before the war, many German soldiers actually had lived and worked in the UK, in Britain. And a lot of the regular soldiers had been in the service industry, working as waiters in restaurants and hotels. So they spoke pretty good English. And so Major Hansen mentions how troops used this to rile up their opponents across no man's land by yelling things like, "Waiter, sausages for two," and such calls. It gets them mad, and they open up at us. Then we sing Rule Britannia and the Maple Leaf, etc. So I can well
I
imagine.
could totally see you being in your element, being one of those shit disturbers.
Well, I do like sausages. Um, some men still had access to beer at that time, that which would later be replaced by our famous rum ration. And of course, that was a big morale booster. Another huge morale booster was the chance to take a bath, which was rare and infrequent. And the RMR managed to get a proper bath, which by trench standards was a small miracle. And there's a great quote from a letter to the editor of the Montreal Daily Mail, again in March 1915. He writes, I had a bath yesterday for the first time since in London over 2 months ago, and I can assure you it is the biggest luxury I had for many a long day. It is an odd picture to see about 60 of us standing naked round shallow tubs, being timed by the clock, while we remove the accumulation of many weeks' dirt. 10 minutes was the time allowed. As soon as we were out, another bunch of grimy soldiers took our places. The relief wrought by that 10 minutes of soap and water was inestimable. We hope we shall not have to wait 2 months for the next. I fear they did have to wait at least 2 months for the next. But also, can you imagine? It's not that they're emptying out those tubs of water,
Yeah,
after one
yeah.
batch
I guess at
gets
a
in.
certain point they must have to. 'Cause
So the first few batches going in, you know, I don't know how clean you're getting, but at least you're able to wipe something off, and that feeling of warm water on your skin is, of course, great.
Well, I remember in the RMR on a Milcon, one of the summer concentration exercises, and we were trucked off to the showers, and you'd load up all your gear. We had some troops. There's a slight disciplinary incident which some listeners will be smirking to right now because there was a summary trial involved afterwards. But and most of them involved, but as we say, no names, no pack drill. But
That's
we
right.
had trucked off, and you think about it, you go, the logic is just is beyond belief. Is that we had to load up into the back of these 2.5 ton trucks, drive along these dusty roads, so that all the dust is
Hmm.
rolling and you're getting completely covered in
I
dust.
remember that.
Get off,
Yes.
shower, put on your new combats, your clean ones, get back into the trucks, drive back for 20 minutes, getting recovered in dust
Yes.
and dirt. Just like,
Yes.
oh, good. We're all showered and clean. That's awesome.
Yes.
Yeah,
Feel great now.
feel awesome. Thank you. So yes, but orders were orders, as we say. It's hard to exaggerate how difficult the muddy conditions would have been. And you had mentioned the stench before, and just made me think of that summer Milcon exercise, which was in the summer. Can you imagine the bodies and the
Mm.
stench in the summer? Because this
Oh,
time we're talking about was right about like now. It's March. It was temperatures were around freezing, just slightly above. Wouldn't
yes.
have been that bad.
Yeah.
But oof.
Yeah. But
But
summer,
your
my
good buddy
God.
there, Major Paul Hansen, one of the RMR company commanders, he described the trenches in a letter. Quote, "We are all the time working, improving and strengthening them, though they have been nearly in the same place for 5 months. We have to pump and use pails to keep the water down. In some places, you can sink waist deep in the mud. On our left, we are only 60 yards from the Hun, and the longest distance is 300 yards. All barbed wire and catch wire in front, which we will repair at night. And it's a ticklish job, I can tell you. They send up a flare and you drop to the ground. If they see you, they turn on the Maxim gun. Waist deep mud? That's traumatic, man. Most of us Canadians know how difficult it is as a kid to try and maneuver in snow that's waist deep. You imagine mud?
Yeah. And mud doesn't smell very good. Snow doesn't smell. Mud
No, especially mud that is
stinks.
in, these are in
So
farmland, so they've been fertilized for centuries with
yes.
manure.
Yes. Yes. You
Don't
might
get
find
wounded.
all sorts of stuff growing on your legs, due to how fertile that ground is. Uh, and of course, let's not forget the sniping. I mean, sniping really came into its element in the First World War. And I'm not talking about just throwing insults across no man's land. I mean the kind of sniping when you get hit by that, you're not getting up again. And again, Major Hansen writes, their snipers are wonderful shots. Every man who straightens up gets one through the head sure. I put my own cap up above the parapet on a stick, and it wasn't 2 seconds when 2 bullets went through it. I am glad my hat and not my head in it.
Yeah, no kidding.
Yes. I
So that kind of drives home the point. Curiosity killed the hat.
It's also interesting to note we did that earlier episode on the evolution of the military helmet. So at this point, they were still wearing their forage caps. They weren't
That's right.
wearing any helmet. So not that the helmet at that point would have made much of a difference to a sniper's bullet, but
Probably would have
but
slowed
with a
it down
podcast,
slightly more than a piece of cloth.
slightly more.
Not much.
Yes,
Not much.
yeah, they
High-powered
take out
308
shards
or
of
whatever it
metal
was.
from your head.
Yeah, seriously. But I think Major Hanson's point really important to note how death was constantly surrounding the soldiers. And our correspondent there, Private Whitby, also wrote in his article to the Montreal Gazette, entering the trench, we saw by dim moonlight a little graveyard to the rear, where wooden crosses marked previous defenders. I suppose there is not a trench in all Flanders without its extempore graveyard, the most pathetic evidence of this unholy war. Generally a cross made of packing box wood with a penciled line, Bill Jones, number, and perhaps the epitaph, one of the best, probably fixed under a hot fire. That is the last of many a good man. And of course, spoiler alert, Private Whitby would be dead himself within 6 weeks of having written that. He died as a prisoner of war, dying of wounds suffered in the Second Battle of Ypres, where Canadians encountered gas warfare for the first time. And beyond the physical hardships, we're going to talk a little bit about the psychological toll, because the mental toll of trench life was immense. Soldiers lived under the constant threat of bombardment, never knowing when the next shell would land. Some coped by writing letters home. Others turned to dark humor and gambling. Although officially banned by the Army, it was a constant, with Crown and Anchor being one of the favorite card games. Canon Scott, who was the original Padre of the RMR and then became Padre for the First Division, was always talking about writing how he managed to be able to turn a blind eye and give the troops a few minutes or a few seconds to quickly turn over the blankets that they were using that had the Crown and Anchor on them. Well, he would look the other way, quite literally, for a second.
Nothing happening here.
So he wouldn't have to get them charged, yeah. And then, of course, there were German attacks. These would really take a toll on the psyche of our Canadians. One of the most appalling incidents that would have shocked the sensibilities of the newly arrived Canadians that we came across in our research was when German forces fired on ambulances that were evacuating wounded Canadians in 1915, an act that, of course, violated all the battlefield conventions and made the Canadians realize just who they were dealing with. And maybe it was these early incidents that kind of cemented the Canadians' reputation for not being the best at taking prisoners.
Yeah, it's not gentlemen at that point.
No,
really. And this is where you really begin to see little episodes of the unwarranted brutality. I mean, the German march through Belgium is well documented, and you have your first instances of terrorism towards civilians, or at least the first really documented ones. Right. I'm sure it happened earlier on, but here you have it in large scale format. Captain Curry, and here we're talking about Captain Victor Curry, not General Sir Arthur Curry, who I'm sure we will cover in a later future podcast. He wrote a letter describing trench life in 1915, and he captured the sentiment of life in the trenches quite well. He writes, I suppose you have seen by the papers, or perhaps, as you said earlier, the aristocratic element. I'm sure he had a bit of a spoke with a bit of a clipped accent. I suppose you have seen by the papers that we have been in the trenches. We were in 48 hours at one place in 2 spells of 24 each, and have just put in 72 hours straight over here. Came out yesterday at 1 a.m. I had the worst part of the line, very weak parapets and spots, and the Germans only 100 yards off. We lost only 1 man out of 16 in our fort, so it didn't do badly. This poor chap stood up too high and got it in the head. There you go. It was terrible getting out after a day's rain. The communication trenches were knee-deep in mud, and walking well stooped over with a heavy load was some work. It took me an hour to make 1/2 mile to the road, with 20 men ahead of me. Germans sending up flares all along and sniping like fun. We are now back a couple of miles resting up. The regiment goes in again tomorrow night for 3 days, but I think No. 3 Company gets the reserve billet on account of having the dirty end last time. That gives us 9 days out. But of course the reserve company does all the fatigues and takes in rations, etc. to the men in the trenches. The reserve billets are a mile out, and are shelled often. Today they put 4 shells in one room at battalion headquarters where Colonel Curry is today. No one hurt, as shells didn't explode. They yesterday shelled the town we were in the other day, badly damaging several places where we were billeted. We just got out in time.
Wow. That's incredible. I mean, I was talking about the psychological toll. You imagine 4 shells landed in your
Yes,
headquarters and didn't explode?
yes, yes. I have to say, I wonder how many of the troopies felt sympathy, though.
True. I
Headquarters.
think at that time you've only been in for about a month or so in the trenches. I think you'd be sympathetic that four shells landed inside one room. That'd be pretty powerful. Like, and they didn't explode. I
Talk
also
about
like how
accuracy.
I also like how Captain Curry notes that rest periods weren't exactly restful, and I think that's something really important
No,
to note. Like,
it is. Yeah, yeah. We can talk about that perhaps also. That's a good subject because you didn't get any rest at all, did you?
no, you were carrying supplies, you were carrying all the pickets up, you were carrying all the ammunition up, you were carrying the rations up, you were carrying wire up, you were bringing bodies back and burying them wherever you could.
Yes.
You were digging out the communication trenches. You were trying to drain the communication trenches. You were pumping. You were filling sandbags. It was tough work. Sometimes in quieter areas in the front where there wasn't much fighting, the troops actually looked forward to going to the front line because you'd get away from doing so much work.
I was just going to mention that there are
Yeah.
instances where people have written back saying just want to get back into the line.
Rest wasn't so restful.
Rest wasn't so restful at all. Um, yeah, incredible. So the Canadians also dealt with some of the stress by taunting the Germans. That was one great way, of course, which is carried down through time. Tim Cook, in his book At the Sharp End, Canadians Fighting the Great War, 1914-1916, mentions one notable incident in which Canadian troops hoisted a large sign over their trench that read, "Gott mit uns," but we have the Canadians. So what this meant is it was a parody of the German military motto, "God is with us," which was commonly inscribed on German soldiers' belt buckles. So what the Canadians were telling them is both a taunt and a morale booster, suggesting that divine favor was irrelevant because the Germans were now facing the formidable Canadians. So yeah, maybe not Gott mit uns, maybe more Gott hilf uns. God help us. So before we dive into the Armor's first steps into the trenches, it's time for our ever popular, completely unofficial, and sadly totally unendorsed Wish We Had a Sponsor segment.
That's right. And because Pusser's Rum never responded to my unsolicited email, this episode is, we're going to buck tradition, and it's unofficially brought to you by a figment of my imagination, trench tea, the only beverage brewed over a flickering paraffin stove, strained through a sock, and served lukewarm in a dented mess tin. Guaranteed to taste like nostalgia, cigarette ash, and just a hint of last week's bully beef.
Trench tea, because nothing says, "I'm surviving the Western Front," like a cuppa made with water that was probably meant for the horses.
Drink responsibly, or at least make sure it's not the latrine bucket.
And with that steaming thought, let's take a look at how the Armor first approached the trenches in 1915. I'm not so sure that was a figment of your imagination. I think it might have been a distant memory because it seems to conjure up some memories of my own. So, so before the commercial break, and I use the term commercial break very
Very
loosely
loosely.
here, we were talking about the effect of sniping and shelling, and in connection with one of our earlier episodes about Canadians serving in the U.S. Army in Vietnam. So the first RMR killed in action was actually an American who had crossed the border to volunteer to serve with Canada in August 1914. This was Private Edmund Eugene Hopey from Dorchester, Massachusetts, and he became the first RMR soldier killed in action, shot by a sniper while covering a parapet. His death was registered on March 4th, 1915. That grimly marked the true beginning of the regiment's war experience.
Yeah, let's talk about the dangers that were lurking everywhere. Sniper fire was a constant threat. It's come throughout the entire narrative today. It keeps coming up over and over again in all the different accounts that are coming through. And as evidenced by the story of an RMR soldier who was killed for carelessly exposing his head above the parapet, which I think your Captain Curry had been talking about in one of his letters there.
Yes,
Quote,
that's right.
German snipers with their telescopic sights on their rifles were especially adept at picking off the unwary. Private Stevens described what happened to one of his careless mates. Pat Radigan, he was on top of the trench pounding down some sandbags, and somebody said, "You crazy something? Get down out of there." And next thing some of us heard was a crack put, and Pat got it in the tummy. And that was our first man. Well, in actual fact, Radigan was not the first member of the Armagh to be killed in action. As Rejoy just said before, that was Private Edmund Hopey from Dorchester, Massachusetts. But there'd already been 5 others who'd been killed in action between March 4th and March 10th, 1915, by the time poor old Pat Radigan was shot in the stomach. And he says shot in the tummy, but God damn it. I mean, being shot in the stomach is a horrible way to die. It takes
It's
hours and
one of the
hours and
worst ways.
hours of being of great pain.
Really, I mean, if you're gonna get it, one in the head
Would be
over
much
something
nicer, yes.
much nicer. Being hit in the stomach is the worst possible way to go. So where does this leave us? The Armagh arrived, they'd endured, faced their real first test in combat conditions, and well, suffered their first casualties. They were getting into the swing of things, understanding how trench warfare worked, understanding what life on the Western Front was about. And though not exactly yet battle hardened, they were starting to sculpt their reputation as a tough fighting unit, and the shape of the regiment to come was beginning to form.
That's right. And like all the other Canadian infantry units, they're really starting to come into their own and figure what it's going to all be about. And they weren't just enduring the trenches; they were starting to master them. And in a future episode, we're going to explore what came next, the major battles, the heroism, and the defining moments of the RMR and all Canadians on the Western Front. For example, within a month of this period that we've been describing in today's episode, the Germans first used gas attacks on the Western Front, a terrifying new weapon that had made its debut on the Western Front in April 1915.
Yeah, it's hard to overstate how shocking this was. I mean, there had been no experience of anything like this before in the past. Gas attack didn't just kill; they maimed, they terrified, they completely changed the nature of the battlefield. Um, they've been the due to gas attacks. I mean, you've got a lot of the war art that came out of the First World War is evocative of the effects of gas attacks. All those pictures and paintings of men with their eyes bandaged up, holding onto each other as they're led back to aid stations because they can't see. They're blinded, coughing up their lungs. Um, the Canadians had no proper gas masks at first. In fact, no Commonwealth troops had any gas masks because nobody had expected this. Just makeshift cloths soaked in urine, and that was an ad hoc solution when the gas started coming over. And I believe it was the NCOs as always taking command of the situation, yelling out, "Okay, boys, piss on on cloth and hold it to your nose," and that's what they did. Uh, the Armor's first Victoria Cross was earned at the Battle of Ypres, and we'll be covering that depth in a future episode. Um, so it's really, I mean, when you talk about the gas attacks, there's so much that you can really get into, and yeah, we will definitely cover that in future episodes. Now, if you enjoyed this dive into history, check out our website at rumration.ca for more insights, letters, and photos from the RMR's time on the Western Front.
And until the next time, stay safe, keep the spirit alive, and remember, trench life is no joke. It's still being endured today, unfortunately, in Ukraine and other places around the world. Let's raise a glass to their memory.
Cheers to history.
Cheers to history.